Hello, my name is Robert Jacobs. I'm a first-year undergraduate student at California Baptist University, and today I'd like to speak with you concerning something I feel should be at the forefront of the American political debate, yet somehow manages to fall by the wayside. I'm referring to the mass incarceration of American citizens for crimes which are arguably harmless. Throughout the course of today's presentation, I'd like to provide you with an overview of the history and events leading up to the current incarceration crisis, discuss the underlying legal philosophy that has allowed us to reach this point, provide you with some statistics to show the implications of the crisis, and then present what I feel to be the most effective solution to ending it, namely the redefining of criminality and the restructuring of the criminal justice and legal systems based on the harm principle. As we all know, the 1960s were a very turbulent time in America. In the middle of the hippie revolution, there was the widespread liberalization of nearly every tenet of American life, everything from sexual relations to drug use to political philosophies, particularly among the younger generation. Older, more conservative Americans, understandably, recoiled in horror as the America they thought they knew was becoming more and more liberal. As such, in 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president. During his campaign, Nixon made the claim that doubling the conviction rate in this country would do more to cure crime than quadrupling the funds for Humphrey, his opponent's, war on poverty. Upon his election, Nixon went on to declare a war on crime. Similarly, in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was elected president. And during his first term, in 1982, he enacted a war on drugs. These tough-on-crime policies are indicative of America's desire to return to a more traditional America, to, if you will, an idealized America with traditional moral values and beliefs, where dissenting opinions and actions were criminalized. Essentially, Americans desired to legislate morality back into their nation. If you will, they wanted to hold their fellow citizens accountable to the same moral beliefs they themselves held. There's an entire legal philosophy dedicated to this. It's called legal moralism. Legal moralism basically states that it is perfectly acceptable for the government to use force or punish any actions that are deemed to go against collective society's moral judgments, or rather, society's collective moral judgments. In America, that takes the form of the majority of Americans voting to criminalize behaviors they find immoral or undesirable. Legal moralism has caused absolute havoc in this country. Whereas we like to consider ourselves the land of the free, we now have the distinction of incarcerating more people than any other nation on earth. In fact, the United States incarcerates 33% more people than China, despite having a quarter of China's population. From 1925 to 1974, America consistently incarcerated about 200,000 people annually at the federal and state level. However, by the early 1980s, following Nixon's war on crime, that number had doubled. And by 2013, we have reached a point where we incarcerate 1.5 million people at the federal and state level, with an additional 730,000 people incarcerated at the local level, in county jails and whatnot. Not only are quite literally millions of Americans incarcerated and effectively under government control, but mass incarceration disproportionately affects minorities. For instance, research was done into the likelihood that a person born in 2001 would have to face incarceration at some point in their life. And the research found that men faced a 1 in 9 chance of facing incarceration. However, a distinction lies in the fact that white men faced a 1 in 17 chance, whereas black men faced a 1 in 3 chance. This disproportionate effect on minority shows the inherent unfairness of a legal system based on legal moralism, because essentially the majority can dictate that whatever actions a specific minority might choose to partake in to be immoral and illegal and quite literally deserving of punishment. So then, because mass incarceration is fueled by the legal philosophy of legal moralism, I propose a extensive and perhaps more radical solution to ending mass incarceration. I believe that restructuring the criminal justice and legal systems based on the harm principle and the subsequent legalization of victimless crimes would effectively end mass incarceration and mitigate its effects in society. According to the harm principle, which was first described at length by John Stuart Mill, a 19th century British politician and political theorist, according to the harm principle, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Crimes that are currently considered illegal, but that would be considered legal under the harm principle, include things such as drug possession and use, prostitution, gambling, even simple things like jaywalking, driving without a seatbelt. Now, it's important to make a distinction right from the start between the acts and the circumstances which often surround them. For instance, marijuana use and possession would be considered legal under the harm principle, and in accordance with what I'm proposing. However, driving your car and subsequently crashing into a pedestrian while under the influence of marijuana would remain criminal. The difference is when you've crashed into someone, you've caused harm to them. When you just simply use marijuana, you haven't caused harm to anyone. Although people will try to make the argument that you're harming yourself, I believe that you should be sovereign over yourself, and that no one should be able to coerce you to do something on the basis of harming yourself. Another example would be, for instance, methamphetamine use. Obviously a harder drug, if you will, and one that very few people are calling to legalize, as opposed to marijuana. In accordance with the harm principle, methamphetamine use would be legal. However, using methamphetamine and holding someone up at gunpoint would be inherently illegal. It would remain criminal because you're, at the very least, taking away their liberty, causing them harm. However, the act of using methamphetamine, while harmful to you, scientifically, you remain sovereign over yourself. So then, now that we've made a distinction between the actions and the circumstances surrounding them, I want to talk about how restructuring the legal system based on the harm principle would end mass incarceration. According to the Bureau of Federal Prisons, 48.3% of federal inmates have been convicted of drug charges. Similarly, 17.3% of state inmates have been convicted of drug charges. This adds up to about 22% of the total state and federal prison population. So if we know that approximately 1.5 million people are incarcerated at the state and federal level, that makes for about 300,000 people at the least. If we were to restructure the legal system based on the harm principle, then those 300,000 people would no longer have committed a crime and would be eligible for release. Downsizing the prison population by 22% at the least, because that doesn't include the number of people incarcerated for things like prostitution and gambling, which is admittedly low, but still a number that adds up to people incarcerated for victimless crimes. Dropping the prison population by such a large percentage would radically decrease the overall societal effects of mass incarceration. For instance, we know that it is very difficult for someone who has been to prison to find gainful employment upon their release. And essentially, we would be ending the vicious cycle of incarceration where you get incarcerated, you're released, now you have that record, you have trouble finding employment, and you almost have to turn back to crime in order to try to live, and subsequently you're incarcerated again. The cycle repeats itself. It's a terrible cycle. So essentially, instating the harm principle would end this vicious cycle for a large percent of the American prison or incarcerated population. Now, because mass incarceration has become such a problem within the United States, even to the point that both sides of the political spectrum have identified it as a problem and proposed solutions to end it, there have been quite a few solutions proposed. Two of the most prominent, however, are the repeal of three strikes laws and the legalization of marijuana. The repeal of three strikes laws refers to some laws found in some states which state that should a person be convicted of three separate offenses, then they face either a very lengthy prison sentence or life in prison. The details vary from state to state. While the legalization of marijuana refers to, obviously, the legalization of the distribution, use, sale of marijuana, as recently enacted in Colorado and Washington. Now, both of these things would certainly reduce the number of people incarcerated. However, they wouldn't decrease it by nearly as much as instituting the harm principle. And furthermore, because the reason mass incarceration is a problem is legal moralism, these problems don't tackle the problem of legal moralism. They essentially use legal moralism as a means of temporarily securing the liberty of American citizens. Because supposing that the nation should decide that three strikes laws are immoral, there's no guarantee that 10, 15, 20 years from now, the nation will make a decision that three strikes laws were a good idea. Similarly, I have to ask the question for Colorado and Washington, what will happen to those people who have decided to make their livelihoods lawfully cultivating and distributing marijuana should 10, 15, 20 years from now citizens of those states decide that marijuana is a societal evil that deserves to be banned? Will those people face incarceration? It's unclear and ambiguous because legal moralism is a system or a legal philosophy that is ambiguous. So clearly we need a principle. We need a definition of criminality, and the harm principle provides that. So having shown that the harm principle is the most effective and secure way of ending mass incarceration, I'd also like to demonstrate that it's more in line with American values and ideals. And in order to do so, we have to ask a pretty basic question. And that is, what is the purpose of a government? Well, when we read the Declaration of Independence, we all know that Thomas Jefferson wrote that we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Later in the Declaration, though, he goes on to write that governments are instituted among men for the security of these rights, or rather, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Now, we've established, therefore, that the American government was instituted in order to secure the natural, unalienable rights of its citizens. The unalienable rights that Jefferson was referring to were first more in-depth described by John Locke, a 17th century English philosopher and political theorist. He wrote in his second treatise of government that all men have the right to protect their life, liberty, and property. And Jefferson was channeling, if you will, Locke in the Declaration. So then, having established that all people are born with the natural right to their life, liberty, and property, and that governments are instituted to secure these rights, it's no stretch of the imagination to believe that the purpose of a government is to secure the rights of its citizens from violations of their natural rights. However, we have to go into detail. Things like life and property are very obvious. Obviously, if you have the right to property, it's what you own, and the government has a duty, therefore, to protect it from theft, vandalism, damage. Life, obviously, it has a right, or it has a duty to ensure that murderers aren't running through the streets. But liberty is something that needs to be defined a bit more clearly. What exactly is liberty? Well, Thomas Jefferson went on, not in the Declaration of Independence, but to state that he believed that liberty was unobstructed action according to our will within limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. So, for instance, Jefferson believed that we were all at liberty to do whatever we wanted so long as we didn't violate the rights of others. So I have the right to do as I please so long as I don't violate your right to life. If I violate your right to life, presumably I've murdered you. If I violate your right to property, presumably I've stolen something of yours or taken it without your permission. And we'll see that violations of these rights confer tangible harm. For instance, I mentioned that if I violate your right to life, then I've probably murdered you. That would be an extreme form of harm. While if I steal your car, it caused harm to you in that you no longer have something that was valuable to you. Your estate or your property has been damaged. So we see there's a dichotomy. The government has a responsibility to protect your property and life, but also has a responsibility to protect every individual's liberty. So long as we are acting in our liberty and not violating the life and property of others, then we're free. And it's no stretch of the imagination to correlate violations of life and property, and even liberty, in the case of things like enslavement. That's not so much a problem in America today, but those confer harm. So violations of natural rights are harmful. And that is the best definition of harm that I can possibly think of. The government has a responsibility to protect its citizens from harm, that harm being violations of their natural rights. I don't believe that is in any way a stretch of the imagination. I'm going to hit this one more time, because I would hate for this to shut off on me. So then, having established that America was founded essentially to protect its citizens from harm while also securing their liberty to do whatever they do as they please, provided they don't harm others, legal moralism has no standing. Even though it sounds American, because it's the majority of Americans essentially enforcing their will and their beliefs on others, we have to remember America is not a democracy. America is a democratic republic. It's a nation ruled by laws and principles. Um, Even if the majority wanted to, uh, I guess, absurd example coming to mind, institute a monarchy, it can't. We have a constitution. We have a principle protecting us. We have, for instance, should the majority of Americans decide that a certain group doesn't deserve the right to free speech, we have the Bill of Rights to protect it. In the same way, even if the majority of Americans decide that you should not be able to smoke marijuana, we have a definition of liberty by Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders, that perfectly supports the harm principle. And should we enact the harm principle, we have a principle supporting essentially the liberty of every American to do as they please so long as they don't cause harm. You have that right to smoke marijuana so long as you don't cause harm to anyone. You have that right to do essentially anything so long as you don't cause harm. And that's something that's hard, that's difficult for people to grasp sometimes. We love the idea of a democracy. We love the idea of having a say in what goes on. But we have to realize that the majority or the collective moral society, judgments of society are incredibly fickle. For instance, prior to 1962, sodomy was illegal in all 50 states, regardless of whether it was consensual. 50 years later, we decided that same-sex marriage should be legal for everyone in all 50 states. I alluded to the idea that there's no security for the people in Colorado and Washington who have decided to cultivate marijuana and lawfully distribute it, because we don't know how society is going to go. As we saw with Nixon and Reagan and Johnson and Carter, conservatism and liberalism, there's a wave almost. We'll go in one direction and then we'll head back down in the other direction. So that's why we need a principle to define criminality in America, because that's how we secure liberty for ourselves. A lot of times, opponents of the harm principle will make the argument that it's cold. They'll say that legal moralism is looking out for other citizens. Essentially, it's playing Big Brother for them, or being their brother's keeper. They see that a certain behavior is harmful or immoral, and they don't want them to do it because they believe it's harmful or immoral. So that they're willing to even go to the extreme of coercing or punishing them to prevent them from doing it. But that's a flawed, that doesn't chime with America, because as we saw before, America is about liberty. They'll go so far as to say that if you support the harm principle and believe in victimless crimes, then you must not care. You must think that you're better than those other people that you'll allow to smoke methamphetamine and do heroin and prostitute themselves. When in reality, I care about them, as I'm sure most proponents of the harm principle do. But at the same time, I'm not willing to force my morals onto them. You see, for me to force my morals onto them, I have to believe that I am more morally enlightened. And if I believe I'm more morally enlightened than someone, then I can evangelize to them. I can try to convince them that, hey, you shouldn't do heroin. That's bad for you. But I'm not willing to take away parts of their life just because I feel that their decisions are bad. Take away parts of their lives, meaning literally spend them in prison. And also, Anyone who has spent an amount of time with people with drug addictions knows that incarceration is not the answer. Even though they may claim that they're tough on crime because they care, my experience, I have never seen any individual positively impacted by a prison sentence through a long chain of events. I attended regularly a Bible study geared towards people, or men specifically, recently released from prison or battling drug addiction, or whose wives were about to leave them. Things of that nature, men who were on their last straw. And I saw plenty of men who had previously been some of, I'm sure, the most terrifying individuals on the planet, men convicted of murder, shooting, stabbing, men with scars all over their bodies, who through a personal relationship with Christ were transformed into some of the gentlest and nicest, albeit some of them slightly off, men I've ever met. Whereas I watched men who went to jail for things like marijuana possession only begin the cycle, as I alluded to before, of recidivism and spending their entire life in jail, in and out of jail. Brief periods of freedom, but they were never able to beat their addictions or their tendencies because incarceration doesn't fix those things. If we really want to make a moral society and help people, then we need to introduce them to Jesus. So we can't take the failures of the church and of individual Christians and make that the duty of the government. And we can't say it's really hard to convince people to believe in Jesus, essentially, and live moral lives. How about if they don't live moral lives, we send them to jail? That just doesn't work. That's not American, and it's not helpful to anyone. So, I suppose that some of you may be wondering at this point, what does this have to do with me, Robert? And I have to confess to you, I wondered the same thing when I was first assigned this project. After all, I don't do drugs. I don't pick up prostitutes. I also, you'll have to forgive me again. I also try to obey the laws and be a good citizen. So what do I benefit from working to end mass incarceration? I'll be honest with you, there's absolutely nothing to gain. You might pay slightly lower taxes because you won't have to fund as many prisoners, but there's nothing to gain. In fact, there's probably more to gain by continuing mass incarceration. You won't have to worry about suddenly 22% of the prison population being back on the street. You won't have to worry about the problems that will be associated and the political debates, political tension that would be associated with restructuring the legal system. So essentially, you have a bit to risk, but very little to gain. But I suppose that the same question could have been posed to the Founding Fathers. What did they have to gain from being concerned with the individual liberties of their fellow Americans? We often forget that they risked quite a bit. After all, they didn't have much to gain. They were already well established. Men like Washington, who was a decorated war hero. Men like Jefferson, who was an established lawyer. Men like Franklin, who could do essentially anything they set their mind to and were connected on both sides of the Atlantic. They didn't really have anything to gain by taking up the cause of the revolution. Like us, they might have had to pay slightly lower taxes. But they had so much more to risk than this. They had to risk their lives. We face rejection. They faced rifles. We face a war of hearts and minds, if you will. They faced war with the most powerful nation on the planet at the time. They risked their lives, their families, and their estates. And all we have to risk is perhaps feeling a little embarrassed or being willing to provide a dissenting opinion in the political discussion. So these men who had so little to gain yet so much more to risk, because they absolutely would have been hung for treason should the revolution have failed, were willing to take up the cause of liberty of everyday Americans and essentially light the flame of liberty across this nation. And I have to wonder, are we willing to so disgrace their efforts and their sacrifices and the risks they took by being unwilling to have a conversation or to have a dissenting opinion? America was founded by patriots and extremists, but are we so unwilling to even have a mildly dissenting opinion, to suggest that individual liberty at the expense of security is a good thing? I don't think that that would at all be proper for us. I don't think that America can survive if we are unwilling to take a little risk. But at the same time, what we're doing is so small. After all, I'm not advocating at all open rebellion against the government. I'm not saying that we storm the prisons and demand the release of anyone convicted of a victimless crime. I'm saying that we talk to our friends, we talk to our family, we discuss political things. America at the time of the revolution was absolutely up to date with the political debates. Things like the Federalist Papers. Common Sense was the most read book in America. It was absolutely vital to Americans to discuss politics and debate and have an opinion and be knowledgeable. And sometimes in America today, we've lost that. And so we need to be bold enough to learn and discuss and teach. And even though these things might seem so small compared to the cause of the founders, we have to remember that even though the flame that they lit in the revolution has, if you will, gone down to an ember, just a smidgen of what it was, the love for liberty has been greatly reduced. We have to remember that even though the things that we are doing are small, all it takes to get an ember glowing hot again and ready to ignite everything around it is a little air, is a gust of wind or breath. And I propose to you that that is all that we have to do, is speak and communicate, and we can effectively end mass incarceration in America. Thank you.